Hello and welcome to today's video. My name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns, I teach knitting workshops in person and online, and I sell pretty yarns. You can find the links to my website and my pattern shops and everything else below this video or at YarnAddict.co.uk. Today I'm going to share my top tips for shawl knitters. A few tips to help you get started or to give you advice if you're finding shawl knitting a bit challenging or intimidating, and also a few reasons why you might want to have a go at shawl knitting. I've been knitting shawl for probably 16, 17, maybe 18 years. When I first discovered that shawl knitting was a thing, I didn't really understand why people would knit shawls. I didn't really see the point in it. And then I saw a lace shawl in a magazine and I was tempted and I gave it a go. It was in quite thick yarn. I think it was in an American magazine. I can't remember the name of it. And I did find it quite difficult because I was new to shawl knitting. I was new to lace knitting. And then I discovered a book called Victorian Lace Today by Jane Sowerby, and it's a beautiful book, and it was basically the book that got me hooked on lace knitting. I knitted a couple of shawls from there. They were quite challenging, and after that I was just hooked on both shawl knitting and on lace knitting, and I haven't looked back since. So one of the questions I quite often get is, why would you want to knit a shawl? A lot of people say to me, what do you do with a shawl? Do you wear it? How do you wear it? Why would you want to knit a shawl? Shawls are basically useful pieces of fabric. You can wear them in lots of different ways. You can wear them traditionally as a shawl across your shoulders. You can wear them as a scarf. You can wear them as a cape, as a poncho, as a shrug. Loads of different ways to wear shawls. I probably mostly wear mine as a scarf. I quite often bundle them up around my neck and wear them as a scarf. Probably more often than I wear them around my shoulders as a traditional shawl. A friend of mine quite a few years ago kept telling me that she thought my shawls were lovely, but she couldn't see herself wearing them. And then, especially because a lot of the ones I was knitting at the time were quite delicate lace, and she was a bit worried that they would get ripped and things like that. And then she broke her arm. It's quite a serious fracture, and she was in a sling. Her arm was in a sling for months. And she couldn't actually get sweater over or t-shirt or anything over her arm, so her arm was basically bare, and it was summer but it was a little bit chilly at times. And I gave her a shawl that I'd knitted, which was a crescent shawl, but it was quite a wide crescent. It wasn't like a lot of crescents tend to be very long and shallow crescents. This was a wider, deeper crescent, and it was knitted in really pretty, very colourful, very soft, luxurious yarn with a bit of sparkle. And I gave her that, and she found it really useful to drape it across her shoulders and her arm. It covered her arm, and she could tie the ends together so it stayed on, and she found it really useful, and she wore it a lot, so that was really good to see. Personally, I wear shawls most of the time just as scarves. I bundle them up around my neck, and that's how I tend to wear them. But they are quite nice to wrap around my shoulders as well. In the winter, I tend to quite often have a shawl on the back of my chair. So if I get a bit chilly in my office in the afternoon, I'll quite often put one on. I also tend to keep one on the back of my chair in the lounge where I sit and knit. And if I get a bit chilly when I'm knitting, I tend to put one over my shoulders. Shawls can often include lots of different techniques and different shapes. There basically is no limit to the different types of shawl shapes you can do. I started exploring traditional triangular ones, rectangle ones, and then semicircle, circle, crescent, but you can mix a lot of these shapes as well and turn and make new shapes. If you're familiar with some of the shawls that Stephen West designs, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. Shawls can also include loads of different techniques. So I'm most well known for lace shawls, but you can use any kind of stitch pattern, from stocking stitch or garter stitch to lace knitting. It can be easy lace, complex lace, brioche knitting, stranded color work, intarsia, slip stitch color work, basically anything. There's loads of different options when it comes to shawl knitting. There basically are no limits when it comes to shawl knitting, either to the type of stitch patterns you can use or the type of shape you can use. Think of the surface of your shawl as a canvas, and you want to fill that canvas with stitches. I found that quite useful when I was learning to design shawls, to think of it in that way, and you can basically fill that canvas with anything. Sometimes combining stitch patterns and shapes can be a bit challenging, especially if they are techniques that are new to you. I remember the first time I tried to work out how to knit a top down triangle shawl with the center spine, so this kind of shape. I thought triangles you would have to start at the bottom at the tip, and I didn't realize that most of them actually start at the top. And I also didn't realize that you can knit them sideways and turn them into asymmetrical triangles just by changing where you put your increases slightly. There are lots of different things that you can do to create different types of shapes, and there are probably just basic triangle. You can do that in loads of different ways, and that's what makes shawl knitting so fun. But it can also make it complex. So if you're dealing with a new technique and you're dealing with new shaping, sometimes that can be a bit challenging, and that's where people quite often get into trouble. They're trying to work out how the shaping works, they don't quite understand it, they can't visualize it, and then they're also dealing with maybe new techniques like lace knitting or brioche knitting or whatever that they haven't done before. So sometimes it can be helpful to break those things down into separate things and practice. So if you're not sure how to knit a top-down triangular shawl with a center spine, just follow the shaping that's in one of those patterns. Don't actually try and do the stitch patterns, just do stocking stitch or garter stitch, and just focus on how the shaping works. And then you might want to practice the stitch pattern if it's a new type of stitch pattern to you, or it's more complex than what you tried before. And once you're confident with both of them, you can then put them together and actually knit the shawl. And I think if you do that, if you find it a bit intimidating or you're struggling to keep the stitch pattern and the shaping correct, breaking them down and practicing them separately can be really helpful. You can use a variety of different yarns, anything from really fine cobweb lace yarns to really chunky yarns. My favourite yarns for shawls are probably 4-ply, fingering weight, sock yarn weight. That's what I tend to use most because I like that weight of yarn anyway, and there's a lot of choice when it comes to that kind of yarn. If you like collecting lots of single skeins of yarn in different colours, you probably find that you have a lot of skeins in a similar yarn weight in loads of different colours, and you might find that you have quite a few colours that go together. And there are loads of shawls now which uses 2 or more skeins. Again, Stephen West is one who likes to use several skeins in his shawls. I try and limit mine to 2 mostly, although I did do this mini skein shawl, but it's not really mini skein shawl because they're 50-gram skeins. But this shawl, which was in a recent issue of Knitting Magazine, issue 234 of Knitting Magazine, I have a video of this, so I'll link that at the end. This used 5 50-gram skeins of merino and silk 4-ply. Some shawls, like this kind of shawl, you can easily adjust the size, and I have a tutorial on that, so I will link that below. The best type of shawls to start with if you are new to shawl knitting is probably the kind of shawls that start with a few number of stitches and then increases. So like the top-down triangle, or this kind of this is kind of a triangle, but it has like a center panel. Can you see this bit that goes down in the middle here? It's a little bit more of a rounded triangle. And most shawls are knitted like this. Start at the top here with something like, this one started with 9 stitches. The blue one that I showed you earlier, this one started with 9 stitches as well, because it's like the top edge is curved. This is Ryan Bay, by the way, which I have a video on as well, which I'll link below. A standard kind of top-down triangle tends to start with 7 stitches, and then you increase as you go. So you tend to increase maybe 4 stitches every other row for a triangle, for example. For Ryan Bay, you increase 6 stitches every other row. So you can do quite a few rows without doing a lot of knitting. So if you do 20 rows, because you start with 9 stitches and then increase 4 stitches every other row, you can do quite a few rows without a lot of knitting time. Whereas if you start with a shawl that has, I don't know, 300 stitches to cast on, and then you decrease or you work straight, if you work 20 rows of that, that's a lot of knitting time. So starting with something where you start with a relatively few number of stitches and then gradually increase can be better if you are worried about making mistakes and perhaps having to rip out and start again a couple of times, because you haven't wasted quite such a lot of time. Also in general, when it comes to the amount of time you spend on something and having to rip out, and you might feel like you've wasted a lot of time, I think if you're learning something from it, you haven't wasted time. Quite often when we make mistakes, we will learn from that mistake. We might make the same mistake again, but hopefully eventually we will learn something from it. So try and think about what you're learning and the fact that you enjoy your knitting. And if you're spending time knitting, then it's not wasted. So my top tips for dealing with mistakes and keeping track of where you are in the pattern, and this is not just relevant to shawls, this is for anything really, is using lifelines. So I have got a tutorial on how to use lifelines. I will link that below. Basically, a lifeline is a piece of spare yarn that you thread through your stitches while they're still on your needles. You thread the yarn onto a sewing needle, and then you slide that sewing needle through your stitches while they're still on your knitting needle. Then you carry on knitting, and your lifeline will just sit where you put it, and then you carry on knitting. And if you make a mistake, you can pull your needles out, rip back till you get to the lifeline, and when you get to the lifeline, your stitches will be sitting on that lifeline, and you can put them back on your knitting needle. If you haven't made a mistake, you just pull your lifeline out and carry on. This is a very useful tool anytime you're worried about making a mistake or fixing a mistake. Another thing I use a lot and I recommend a lot is using stitch markers. The stitch markers are a really useful tool to section off different parts of a pattern, different parts of the row, and also pattern repeats. I think I talk about stitch markers in the same tutorial where I talk about using lifelines, so I will link that below. So I quite often will put stitch markers, either the ring markers that fit on your needles or the removable markers that you can actually attach to your knitting. I use those for different things. I section off pattern repeats. So for complex pattern repeats, I might put a stitch marker every single pattern repeat. I might mark off where I need to increase or decrease, or if a pattern has different sections, like for example this brioche shawl, the colors change halfway across the row, so that impacts the way the pattern is read. So I put a marker here so I would know that I would need to look at a different chart and change the way I was knitting. This is the stitch pattern is fairly complex, but because it's just a rectangle, it's not as difficult as you might think it is. So I hope these tips and ideas were useful. If you haven't knitted shawls before, let me know why you haven't knitted them, what you find challenging. If you have any things that you would like me to do tutorials on when it comes to knitting shawls or lace knitting or anything else really, leave a comment below and I will add it to my list of tutorial ideas. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. And as I said, leave me a comment and let me know if you've tried shawls. Do you like knitting shawls? What do you like about knitting shawls? And what shape of shawl do you normally like knitting? Tell me that in the comments below this video. And I'll link everything I've talked about in this video below. And you can also find some links on the final screen of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.